Firstly, congratulations if you have kept up the whole 11 months worth of our studies. We have about 30 days left. You should know a lot of things by now and join a lot of the dots together. Today we start the book of Philippians, the whole book. It's only 4 chapters. Remember, we are studying what is needed for salvation, not necessarily studying the book of Philippians. In this one, I'm going to do some history, as I normally do for the first chapter, and then this also covers what God requires. So firstly, some history. The city of Philippi was named for Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, who seized the city in 358 BC from Thracians. Later, Octavius, which is Augustus Caesar, made Philippi a Roman colony. It was a principal city on the Great Egnatia Highway in Macedonia. This highway extended from Rome to the Byzantium, and traders from both eastern and western countries stopped there often. This made it a strategic place for the spreading of the gospel. In the early portion of Paul's second missionary journey, God indicated that he wanted Paul to preach the gospel in Macedonia. This we see in Acts chapter 16, verses 9 to 10. Apparently, there were no synagogues in that city as is usual, because on the Sabbath, Paul went out of the city and down to the bank of the river, where he found Lydia and a number of other women who accepted what Paul had to say. Acts chapter 16, verses 13 to 14. Remember, in other places we hear, Paul's custom was to go to synagogues whenever he went to a new city. After Lydia and her family had been baptized, she asked Paul and his companions to stay at her house. Acts chapter 16, verse 15. Later, Paul and Silas were imprisoned for casting the unclean spirit out of a slave girl. Acts chapter 16, verses 16 to 25. This led to the salvation of the jailer and his family. Acts chapter 16, verses 26 to 34. Paul may have visited them again when he journeyed from Ephesus to Macedonia, because he spent the spring with them. Acts chapters 20, verses 1, 6, and 2 Corinthians chapters 2, verses 12 and 13. The church that Paul established there was probably the first in all Europe. The Apostle Paul is thought to have written this letter to the Philippians during his first Roman imprisonment, Acts chapters AD 60 to 62. Paul, who was a tent maker by trade, Acts chapters 18 verse 3, ordinarily refused to receive any financial assistance from the churches. 2 Corinthians chapters 11 verses 7 to 9. However, he did accept gifts from the Philippian brethren when he was in Thessalonica. We see this in Philippians chapters 4 verse 16 and 18. Epaphroditus brought another gift to Paul during his imprisonment in Rome. Philippians chapters 4 verse 18. While Epaphroditus was there, he became severely sick and nearly died. He did recover, however, and carried this letter back to Philippi. Philippians chapters 2 verses 25 to 30. Although there is no development of one particular theme, the concept of the all-sufficiency of Christ is found throughout the book. Joy in God's love for us can be found in almost any situation, even for some, as Stephen in Acts chapter 7, which leaves Paul able to say Christ gives meaning to life and causes people to serve him even to their death. Philippians chapters 1 verses 20 and 21. Okay, reading from the book of Philippians, chapter 1, verse 1. Paul and Timotheus, the servants of Yeshua, to all the saints in Yeshua which are at Philippi, with the bishops and deacons. Grace be unto you and peace from God our Father and from Yeshua. Verse 28. And in nothing terrified by your adversities, which is to them an evident token of perdition, but to you of salvation, and that of God. For unto you it is given in the behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake, having the same conflict which you saw in me, and now here to be in me. So there's no salvational issues really in chapters 1, except in verse 28, and also to note that the grace Paul is used as a welcome greeting, something that he desires that they get. Chapter 2, starting from verse 5. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Yeshua, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in the fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. So I'll inject here, so we have to take on the same mindset as God and become obedient to the Father. Continue to verse 12. Wherefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Verse 13. For it is God which worketh in you, both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Verse 15. That you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. To work out one's own salvation is to do what is necessary to please God. What does God require and worketh in us to achieve? Deuteronomy chapters 10 verse 12. And now, Israel, what does Yahweh thy God require of thee, but to fear Yahweh thy God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve Yahweh thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul. Micah chapter 6 verse 8. He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth Yahweh require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God. Ecclesiastes chapters 12 verse 13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. So how do we become blameless? Luke chapter 1 verse 6. And they talk about John the Baptist's parents, and they were both righteous before God, walking in all his commandments and ordinances of Yahweh, blameless. So that's how they became righteous. Chapter 3, verse 2. Beware of dogs, beware of evildoers, beware of the concision. For we are the circumcision which worship God in spirit and rejoice in Christ Yeshua, and have no confidence in the flesh. Circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. But what things were gained to me, those I counted loss for Christ. Yea, doubtless I counted all things but loss for the excellence of the knowledge of Christ, Yeshua, my Lord, for whom I have suffered and loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ, and not be found having... verse 9. And be found in him, not having my own righteousness, which is of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is of God by faith. that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable unto his death, if by any means I might attain unto the resurrection of the dead. My comment. Another misunderstood words of Paul. He is not saying the law or commandments of God are not to be kept, as most people keep using Philippians to say. He states in the words about dung and so forth. He states there are two ways of righteousness. By your own, which is in the law, i.e. being blameless, keeper of it, as it says in Revelations 22:14, or through the faith in Yeshua, or the transgressors of the law, and repentant transgressors, that is, Revelation chapters 14, verse 12. Paul had both, but preferred the latter as superior, not as a replacement. In the latter, he now knew the reason for the keeping of the law, for following the schoolmaster, to be brought onto the knowledge of Christ, and to know him. Now, to know and practice all the education one receives in school, college, or university is a revelation to those employed in jobs to utilize that knowledge. Remember in chapter 2, verse 15, we are called to be blameless. Though one's own righteousness, if attained, through one's own righteousness, if you can be that perfect, if you attain it, you may lose out on the knowledge of Christ. Paul is simply saying that knowledge of the reason is worth all he had. So knowledge without the reasoning is not as satisfying as knowledge with the reasoning. With the understanding of why you have that knowledge, how to use it. In comparison, they were dung. He's not saying that dung had no value and is not to be done, only comparatively. So I hope that explains Philippians, and I hope I'm correct, and if not, you read for yourself. Philippians chapter 3, verse 12. Now, as though I had already attained, not as though I had already attained, either were already perfect, but I follow after it, that I may apprehend that for which also I am apprehended of Yeshua. For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who mind earthly things. Verse 18, talking about people who's fallen away from the truth and starts of their belly. Probably applies to, I would say, prosperity sermons and people who follow materialistic things, people who come to Christ or the faith thinking they will get things and become prosperous. That is not the teaching of the Bible. Okay, lastly, as usual, there's nothing salvational in chapter 4. So I'm going to move on to showing you that there's nothing new in the New Testament. The verses of Philippians, I'm going to give you the Bible, Old Testament references of them. Chapter 2, verse 7. You have Psalms 22, verse 16. Isaiah 53, verse 3 and verse 11. Isaiah 42, verse 1. And 49, verse 3 and 6. And 52, verse 13. Also have Daniel chapters 9, verse 26. Ezekiel 34, verse 23 to 24. Zechariah chapters 3, verse 8.
The rest of it, I'll leave you to get off of the video screen at the bottom of the page, or you can go to the Word version and cut and paste it as you so wish. Shalom until tomorrow when we come to the next days of our study, God willing.